Well, welcome as we continue our journey, living in the cycle of grace. Really do hope that as we've been journeying together, that this is becoming for you a life-giving journey. So far, we have done two things, and perhaps I can do a brief recap. As you know, repetition is the mother of all learning. You may remember in our first time together that I offered to you a kind of wide-angle overview of the cycle of grace in which Jesus lived. You may like to look at the diagram again, which is before you, that Jesus lived in this pattern, this ongoing pattern, this dynamic cycle of acceptance, sustenance, significance, and then fruitfulness or achievement, as it were, in obedient ministry. That the whole of Jesus' life was characterized by him living in this ongoing dynamic cycle, and that grace was involved in each movement within that cycle. And we noted how tragically, rather than living in a cycle of grace, we often find ourselves living in a cycle of works. We, as it were, live the other way around, the wrong way around. Starting, as it were, with achievement, we hope that will give us significance, and then we hope that will sustain us, and ultimately, maybe in the end, we will be accepted. Frank Lake suggested that is the recipe for burnout, for weariness, disillusionment, cynicism. And so I'm hoping that you've been, perhaps as we've been journeying together, that you've just been reflecting on the cycle, perhaps, which is dominant in your own life at the moment. And then last time we met together, do you remember, we began to delve a little bit more deeply into the grace of acceptance. Jesus lived his life with this profound inner sense of acceptance. He knew that he was the beloved, cherished, delighted in Son of the Father. And we explored how perhaps you and I can accept our own acceptance more deeply. Suggested that we ask for that grace, that we ask God to give us a deeper inner knowing that we are accepted by God. Suggested that we open our life up, our minds and our hearts more widely to Christ's message of acceptance. And then you may remember I invited you just to savor those moments of human acceptance that we receive, sometimes in a very fleeting way, sometimes even from a stranger, and sometimes in a more ongoing way in some of our more significant relationships, just to savor these moments of human acceptance, which give us a glimpse into God's acceptance of us. But I want us now to pause our video. You may remember that I invited you into a practice this week of just stopping now and then, being quiet, putting your hand on your heart, recalling a moment of acceptance, and savoring it, allowing it to become, as it were, a sacrament of God's acceptance of us. So I'm hoping that in your group conversation now you can just share with each other how it went in terms of your own experience of this practice during the week. And it may suddenly hit you that you didn't even do it. And it also may be good to reflect on that and perhaps to share what made it hard for you or difficult for you to get around to engage in this practice over these past few days. And so I hope that your conversation in the group will be connecting. God bless you as you share with one another. Welcome back. I hope you had some good conversation with each other. I often think that what happens in conversation with one another is much more important than perhaps what I'm saying to you. In our input today, I want to take a step further, and I want to explore with you a little bit more deeply the second movement in the cycle of grace, sustenance. You know, when we look at the life of Jesus in the Gospels, he lived a life that was shaped for sustenance. His life was not, as it were, haphazard and reactive. His whole life seemed to have a shape to it. And that shape sustained his life. It kept his life, as it were, open to sustaining grace. You know, often our lives get overwhelmed. You know that, I know that. We get overwhelmed by our responsibilities, the struggles we have at home, the challenges of making a living, the ongoing overwhelming of the struggles that are happening on the streets of our cities. Sometimes we get overwhelmed by loss, by grief. And the one thing that happens when our lives get overwhelmed so often is that they get knocked out of shape. And so I'm really hoping that as we explore this second movement of sustenance, that we can together explore this important question. You know, how do we shape our own lives for sustenance? How do we shape our own lives in such a way that they are continually open to the sustaining grace that God wants to offer to us? And again, as I so often do, I want to share with you three thoughts, very simple thoughts, and I'm again praying that somehow through these thoughts, God will speak a personal word to you today. First of all, we shape our lives for sustenance as we pattern them around the practices of Jesus. You know, when we follow Jesus through the Gospels, and that's a good thing to do, one thing that becomes very, very clear is that he didn't only have a public life, you know, of preaching and teaching and healing and casting out demons and feeding those who were hungry, etc. That was his life, as it were, on the spot. But Jesus, as you follow him through the Gospels, he also had a life, as it were, off the spot. There were those activities that were not so much public, but they were activities which, as it were, opened up Jesus's life to sustaining grace. Now, if I was sitting with you in your group right now, I would say, let's have a brainstorm. And let's brainstorm all the different ways that we see in the Gospels of Jesus finding sustenance. But because I'm not in the group at the moment with you, let me just brainstorm myself with you. Jesus rested. Often we find Jesus resting. Jesus slept, sometimes in the most unlikely of places and in the most unlikely of circumstances. Jesus exercised. He often went on those long walks between towns, just walking from one village to another. Jesus enjoyed meals. And often these meals were celebrated. They were like parties And as you know, Jesus was accused of sometimes partying too much. Jesus had real friends. Sometimes it's very interesting to just look at all the circles of friendship in Jesus' life. He had a close, beloved disciple. Do you remember the friendship of the 3, then the 12, then the 70, then the group of women that he would often be with, the close friendship with Mary Magdalene, his friendship with those in Bethany, Mary, Martha, Lazarus, and I can go on and on. There were circles of friendship in Jesus' life. And I find it very interesting that near the end of his life, he says to the Father, Father, thank you for these people whom you have given me, who have been a gift to me. Jesus had moments in silence, in solitude, often would go to the mountains, into nature, into the wilderness. Jesus worshipped, gathered together with his own people in the synagogue for worship. Jesus immersed his life in the Old Testament scriptures. He knew them. They were part of him. Jesus fasted. Now, I can go on and on and on. I once sat with a group and we discovered 42 different practices through which Jesus received, as it were, sustaining grace. Ways in which Jesus was sustained for ministry and received sustenance and was nourished. Now, I don't think we are called to copy Jesus in a kind of slavish way. We cannot, as it were, live his life. And it's so different from ours. I'm married. Jesus wasn't married. We travel on highways. We do 8 to 5 jobs, etc. But what we can do is we can pay very careful attention to these different practices that were critical to Jesus. And we can begin to discern which of these practices really we need in our own life. Maybe not all of them, but maybe some of them. So, for example, just as a practical example, in my own life, I'm often on the go, meeting deadlines, doing things. One practice of Jesus that really is very, very important to me, it's been important now for years, has been the practice of stillness, solitude, just carving out regular moments, even daily moments of real stillness and solitude, in which I can open my life up to grace. So that's my first suggestion. Secondly, I think we need to shape our lives for sustenance as we pay attention to all the different dimensions of our lives. You know, when you look at all these practices in the life of Jesus, what is striking about them is that they were practices that sustained him in a multi-dimensional way. They sustained him spiritually, emotionally, mentally. They sustained his relationships with others. In one sense, these practices are holistic. So what I want to do very simply is just offer you a kind of home-brewed diagram of the sustenance wheel. And I've almost divided, you can see it now, I've almost artificially divided it up into 4 quadrants. The quadrants of our emotional life, our intellectual or mental life, our physical life, and also our social life, our relational life. And you will notice that at the heart of the diagram, there is that inner circle of sustaining grace that needs to flow into each of these quadrants. I think one of the great dangers, for us is we as it were, develop a split spirituality. We kind of leave out one of these dimensions within our lives, in our walk with God. So, for example, maybe we pay a lot of attention to prayer, but maybe we don't pay any attention to our own bodies and exercise and eating well. Do you see what I mean? And we kind of have a lopsided spirituality. We shape our lives for sustenance when we develop those practices in our life that are going to open each dimension of our life to sustaining grace. So I hope that diagram for you can become a friend, and that maybe as you look at your own shape of your life, do I have those practices that are relating well to each of these quadrants? Thirdly, we shape our lives for sustenance when we consciously open our lives to joy. Jesus was a really joyful person. You can see that throughout the Gospels. He delighted in creation. He loved being with people. There was a joyfulness about so many of his encounters with others. Played with children, hugged them, celebrated his own relationship with the Father. There's this powerful theme of joy running through the life of Jesus. And even though he engaged deeply the pain and the suffering that was always in his midst, somehow kind of joy put its arms around this pain and this suffering. I find it very interesting that near the end of his life, Jesus says to his disciples, I've said all these things so that my joy may be in you and your joy complete. Joy is one of the deepest sources of energy in our lives. Joy is our first line of defense, I believe, against weariness and burnout and cynicism and disillusionment and even disease. Joy is a very powerful source of energy and grace. Now, joy isn't going to just drop on our heads. We need to consciously open our lives up to joy. We need to, as it were, almost choose joy. And that's been a real challenge for me. I think for the last 20 years of my life, I was really a very serious person. And I remember how my kids would often say to me, come on, Dad, lighten up a bit. It was almost as if I allowed the pain, the heartache, the heartbreak of life sometimes to overwhelm me as I opened my life up to it. I remember writing a letter to Dallas Willard, and in this letter shared some of my own lack of joy, my own weariness and fatigue. And I never forget, he wrote a handwritten letter back to me, and I want to quote to you from it right now. He said these words to me. He said, Trevor, find sources of joy and cultivate them. Invest in them, time and money. What do you really enjoy? Things that have got nothing to do with family, work, with religion. And I've been learning to do that now for 20 years, in very simple ways. Every supper time in our home, dinner time in our home in the evening is a celebration. Even if we have takeout pizzas, I'll light a candle, and it's a kind of just a celebrative moment. Birthdays, anniversaries, they become week-long events of celebration. I can go on and on. I hope these three thoughts have been helpful for you. Perhaps we can pause the video and as you get together now with one another, here are two questions for you. What strikes you most in the input today? And can you perhaps, just as you reflect on your own life right at the moment, could you perhaps share with the group just one practice in your life that opens your life up to sustenance, to sustaining grace? And maybe as we share our own practices with each other, we can become resources of learning for one another. So God bless you in this time of interaction. Well, as you know, we end each of our times together with some God work. And the invitation this week is, as you reflect, on the life of Jesus, the off-the-spot life of Jesus, and as you think about all of those practices that were sources of sustenance for him and that opened him up, as it were, to sustaining grace. Can I invite you this week just to select one practice that connects with you, resonates with you, attracts you, draws you. And then for this week, can I invite you to allow this practice to just become an integral part of your daily living? And then maybe next week, as we get together, as we did today, we can just reflect on our experience with that practice. So I'm inviting you this week just to shape your life for sustenance by engaging with one practice from Jesus' life that could be a source of sustenance for you. So I hope you have a good week. Take care.